When the digital era finally reached photography, it brought along a huge number of advantages for photographers. For example, the ability to take an enormous number of photos without increasing the cost, unlike film photography, where every frame mattered. We can now see the image immediately after pressing the shutter. We can also change ISO from shot to shot. In film photography, you had to change the entire roll of film to do that. But one of the most important advantages of digital photography is something that initially scares many beginner photographers. And that is the great and terrible histogram. Just kidding, it's not that terrible at all. And there is absolutely no reason to avoid it. In fact, the histogram is quite easy to use once you understand how it works. A histogram is simply a graphical representation of the tonal range of your photograph. And it helps you evaluate whether your camera settings are correct, which is extremely important for creating high-quality images. Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Apolitov. I am a member of the European Association of Professional Photographers, and my photographs and articles have been published by outlets such as National Geographic and Discovery. Alright, let's not waste any time. Let's get started! In the era of film photography, we had to wait until the film was developed to know for sure whether our photo was properly exposed or not. Today, by using the histogram, this information is literally at your fingertips. Many people ask, why not just look at the image on the camera screen and see if it looks good? Well, first of all, your camera's LCD screen always beautifies the image. Second, when you're shooting outdoors or on location, it's often very difficult to evaluate anything accurately on that small screen because of sunlight or other environmental factors. So how do you read a histogram? It's actually very simple. On the horizontal axis of the histogram, you see the brightness levels of the tones in your image. The left side represents the darkest tones. The right side represents the brightest tones. And the center represents the midtones. On the vertical axis, the histogram shows how many pixels of a given brightness are present in the image. The higher the peak, the more pixels there are at that brightness level. The most important thing you need to know about the histogram is this. If a peak touches the right edge of the graph, you have a problem. A significant part of your image is overexposed or even completely white, with no detail in the highlights. And the biggest issue is that overexposed areas contain no data at all. That means you won't be able to recover any detail there during post-processing, even if you're shooting in RAW format. This applies only when the peak actually touches the edge of the histogram. If the peak is close to the edge but not touching it, everything is fine. If a peak touches the left edge, that means part of your image is completely black. In other words, underexposed areas are present. However, unlike blown highlights, shadow areas usually still contain some information, and you can often recover at least part of that detail during post-processing. And if you're shooting in RAW, your chances of recovering shadow detail are even better. By evaluating the histogram on location, you can use positive exposure compensation to adjust your next shot. But if you're doing something like night photography, for example, shooting the starry sky, then this type of histogram is perfectly normal and healthy for that situation. There is no such thing as a perfect histogram. It's simply a graphical representation of the tonal range in your image. As an artist, you decide what to do with that information. Having a large number of dark or bright areas is not necessarily bad, as long as there is no clipping in the highlights or shadows. Let's take a look at how histograms appear for different types of scenes. By the way, if you're a beginner photographer and you really want to learn how to take great photos, but for some reason it's not working out yet, I recommend checking out our photography course, I Am a Photographer. In this course, we take you by the hand and guide you from zero to creating excellent photographs. The link to the course is in the description of this video. Don't miss the opportunity to enroll with a massive discount. Now let's move on. When you shoot in a high-key style, your image will contain a lot of bright tones and very few midtones and dark tones. When you want to photograph a high-key scene, your histogram should be shifted to the right, but without touching the right edge. If you want a high-key image but your histogram shows a lot of tones in the middle of the graph, your highlights will likely look dull and grayish instead of bright and clean. The histograms of these images clearly show a dominance of light tones. A low-key scene is a dark scene, typically captured at night or in very low light conditions. In this case, your histogram will be shifted to the left. You may also see a peak touching the left edge, indicating the presence of very dark areas. A high contrast scene contains many very dark and very bright tones, and often not many midtones. In this case, the histogram will show peaks on both the left and right sides, with either a dip or a flat area in the middle. Here is a high contrast scene, extremely bright highlights, extremely dark shadows, and very few gray tones. This scene contains a lot of midtones, which is why the peak of the histogram stretches across the center. It also has relatively few highlights. The histogram of such an image often resembles a bell curve. Notice that tonally, this is a low contrast scene, but color-wise, it is high contrast. Once again, as an artist, it's up to you to decide what to do with this information. You can use it or ignore it. The histogram is simply another tool in your arsenal to help you turn your creative vision into great photographs. If you're not satisfied with the histogram of your image, use exposure compensation. This allows you to make the image darker or brighter. Alternatively, you can affect the scene's brightness in other ways, for example, by using a flash, a reflector, or a diffuser. The choice is yours. You may have noticed in the examples that the histogram doesn't just display brightness in grayscale. It also shows color information. Yes, you can overexpose or underexpose a color. Sometimes a specific color becomes extremely bright in a photo, and in some cases, it can be so saturated that you lose detail in that color. This often happens with reds, as in this example. How do you deal with this? The simplest solution is to slightly desaturate that specific color during post-processing to recover some of the detail. For example, in the petals of a flower. The histogram for this image shows a spike in the red tones within the highlight area. During the shoot itself, you can use the histogram together with live view on a DSLR to see it before taking the photo. Or you can simply enable the histogram display on the LCD screen if you're using a mirrorless camera. In addition, you can always check the histogram after taking the shot. All of this is enabled through your camera's menu. In any case, it's extremely important to use the histogram to monitor correct exposure while you're still out in the field. That way, you have the opportunity to reshoot the image while you're still at the location. Do not rely solely on how the image looks on your camera's LCD screen. To evaluate exposure correctly, turn on the histogram. This is important because the brightness of your LCD display has absolutely nothing to do with the actual brightness of your photograph. Remember that. The histogram will also be available to you later during post-processing in any photo editing software. Use it to see which settings need adjustment, so you don't end up with overly bright or overly dark areas in your final image. This information will give you a clear understanding of how to use this incredibly useful tool.